Hello out there to anyone watching. My name is Paul Auger. I'm a member of the Sanford-Springvale Historical Society. I'm also a member of the Sanford Historical Committee, which is part of the city of Sanford. And I've been a high school teacher, history teacher for about 22 years now. And about I think it was 2004, I was covering the influenza pandemic, the very famous Spanish flu of 1918 in class, and I had a student ask me, what happened in Sanford? And my answer was, I don't know. So that launched a big learning project for my students, and we culled every newspaper in Sanford for a period of months, and we studied a lot of maps and things that happen around the world, and we put everything together and came up with what you're going to see tonight. So I've been doing this in school for many years. I've done it for a few organizations, but I've never actually done it during a pandemic. So this will be pretty interesting, and I encourage you to ask any questions you may have. But you can sit back and enjoy this. I'm not at the museum where I would normally be. I'm actually in my living room. so, so here we go. And we got to start out really going back to what medicine was like in 1918. So it really hadn't changed since the Greeks several thousand years before. And getting into medical school was not very difficult at all. In fact, all you needed generally was a high school diploma and the tuition. And they would say, okay, it's a little bit harder today. And the way illnesses were treated right up through 1918 was it was seen as an imbalance. And doctors treated this in various ways, but they figured if you're sick, something is wrong with you, your balance is off, and they've got to restore it. So they did all kinds of things. They gave people purgatives and laxatives, and they figured anything that came out of you was bad, and that way they could restore the balance. And sometimes it didn't work out too well. Sometimes it did, despite what they were doing. So that reinforced their idea that it was the right thing to do. And one of the most common things was bleeding. We kind of call that phlebotomy today. And it was a very common thing. In fact, John Adams, our second president, almost died from that when he was very ill at one point in his life. And just a little bit about viruses in general. They really have one mission. Oh, and I also want to mention I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't have a PhD in this stuff. It's just years and years of studying. So I'm going to try to stay in my lane. And, and if I make any mistakes, feel free to let me know. But all they really want to do is just replicate. That's their goal. And they invade your cells, they get into your blood, and they just want to replicate. Now, influenzas in general nearly always originate in birds. And they typically give them some type of nickname if they get big enough, but they actually have numbers. And really, the only way you can get this from a bird is you really need some pretty massive exposure. So you'll find that usually when you track down these influenzas, they will end up coming from a place where people deal directly with birds, typically butchering them or handling them by hand very often. We really don't do that in the United States very much. In fact, much of that is illegal to produce, but in a lot of parts of the world, it's very common to buy a live animal at the market. So what you would need is you would need to have somebody for this influenza that already has a strain of influenza in them they would get this new strain from typically a bird that is not infectious, very infectious, but because they get a bunch of blood on their hands and an open wound or something along those lines, it then gets in their body and it mutates with the regular flu that we have that typically is very, very infectious, as we know. They come around every year, very contagious. And it's got to adapt for it to be able to do that. So it's not really uncommon, and you'll see these things often mutate. And influenzas or the flu is such an infectious thing that really the only thing that stops it is when it runs out of people to infect. And that's usually because it runs out of people or there's some type of herd immunity built up from either having a lot of people that have already had it or people have been vaccinated for it. And if you ever are in the hospital and you notice something, someone, a relative having a respiratory infection, nearly all of them come from influenza. It's a very regular, fairly predictable thing that happens in our lives all around the world. And antibiotics, you would think, well, can I take something for it? You really can't. And in a worst case scenario, what they need to do is really just go on a ventilator. If you have trouble breathing, the goal is to keep you breathing long enough, even if it's by machine, for things to work through you and keep you alive. So it's got pretty specific symptoms, and we all know we've probably all had the flu at some time. It normally will only get to your respiratory system, and from my studies and what the students have found is the deeper it gets in your lungs, typically the more dangerous it is. And then you can get all kinds of headaches, joint aches, muscle aches. We probably all had that. And once in a while, it can have very grave complications. It's something that we experience around the world. And the good news is, typically, it's about 10 days and you're better. That's as long as they'll last from beginning to end, usually. So a few facts. It's not a cold. So the coronavirus is a version of a sort of like a cousin of the cold, but it's not the flu. It's two very different things. And in a typical normal year, we're looking at tens of thousands of fatalities in the United States. And we didn't know that until we started studying this, how many people actually die from this in a normal year. 36 is pretty in the low range. It's not unusual at all to have 50,000. And a few years ago, we had a particularly bad year in the United States, and there were about 100,000 people that died from the flu. And we have several pandemics every century. It's a typical thing. There's really nothing that unusual about it, except that people forget about them sometimes. So we've lived through several of them. Most of us, we had the swine flu, which is really a terrible name, but it stuck in the press. That was not that long ago. We also had another terrible name, the Hong Kong flu, and we've had several others over the last 100 years. And the very nature of how these things work just makes it inevitable that they're going to keep happening. And a lot of people that have seen this and talked about influenza say, well, that's never going to happen again. Well, it would be more unusual if it didn't happen, because they happen so frequently in every century that you've really got to expect that it's going to happen again at some point. So a little bit about how it gets onto you. They typically, now I'm not an expert. I don't know a whole lot about the coronavirus, but I've been really interested in it since there are a lot of parallels. But typically, this flu will get, once it gets into you, it has a unique way of grabbing onto your cell, and it needs your cell to get that energy to make new copies to help replicate itself. And a typical cell in our research would produce anywhere from 10 to 100,000 copies. And then the cell explodes, and then they go to hit new cells, and it keeps going and going. And all of a sudden, you don't feel well, and you don't really know why. And it's because your body has now detected this and it's trying to stop it. Now, some of these copies are bad copies. It's a little bit like playing the telephone game. Sometimes you get to the end and it doesn't bear any resemblance to how it started. So some of these copies really don't work at all. But once in a while, if enough people get infected, you'll have what experts call a super virulent version come out. And it can be something that will change enough, it will mutate enough where it completely surprises your body. And the immune system is surprisingly what actually led to the most deaths in this pandemic of 1918. And it's really pretty amazing. So when you get one of these influenza viruses, your body may or may not recognize it, depending on if it's had something like it before, and it will start attacking it if you have a regular immune system, and it's going to throw all kinds of things at it. And one of the really neat things is that after your body has defeated this influenza, you'll have a bunch of white blood cells in your body that will remember it, and they'll recognize it, and they will it's almost impossible to get the same influenza strain again because your body recognizes it and fights it right away. And the analogy that helped me understand how this works is, say you have a football player. Your body looks at this football player, this virus, and you always see the same one all the time, and it's got red helmet, red shirt, red pants, we'll say. And you recognize this thing, you see it all the time, so your body fights this thing off pretty easily. Then one day, this football player comes up to you, and it's got a red helmet, a green jersey, and red pants. So your body may recognize it, it may not recognize it. So sometimes you'll get a little bit sick because your immune system doesn't react immediately. You could get sick, you may not. So that's if you have a little bit of what it's called antigen drift. I think I've got that on here. Yeah. So your body may or may not recognize it. Now, sometimes if you have a super virulent change of this influenza, it really mutates. Now, all of a sudden, this football player that is normally all in red, it's got a purple helmet, green jersey, and blue pants. So your body does not recognize this as a bad thing at all. And it just says, come on in, doesn't do anything to it. And that is called antigen shift when that happens. If it's such a different variation, your body really will not have any immunity to it because it's never seen this type of thing before. It really, the antibodies and all of your defenses won't kick in until it really detects there's a problem in your body. So we know from historically that every pandemic generally, when it gets to that pandemic level, will generally infect 15 to roughly 40% of the population, sometimes a little more, sometimes a lot more, but generally it's about 15 to 40. And that's something kind of good to keep in mind with the current pandemic going around. And remember, this is just for influenzas. So typically, once you get it, you'll only be infectious for a week at the most. And very often it's less than that. So we all know, we hear principals and doctors saying, if you feel sick, don't go to school. And that's because you're going to spread this around the school. And the coronavirus going around right now is it's a totally different animal as far as shedding the virus. Doctors really don't understand the entire thing yet, but it's much different than this. And even though you can have the symptoms after, I remember having the flu, and sometimes, my goodness, I felt like I was sneezing for weeks after I had it. So you could still have that, but after that magic week, you're not going to spread it around anymore because your body defeated everything in it. So let's go back now to 1918 to this county called Haskell County. And World War I is going on at that time. And there's a country doctor named Loring Miner. And when we talk about a country doctor, this is what you'd probably imagine in your head. He had a horse and buggy. He knew everybody. He knew all the farmers, very rural area in Kansas. And it was reported by some people later on that Dr. Miner's horse knew the area so well that when he would do a house call and he was really tired, he would just snap the horse to get going, and he would lay down and fall asleep in the seat, and the horse would always find his way home, and he would just wake up when the carriage stopped, which is a pretty neat thing. But he found in early 1918 a bunch of patients were having these really intense, terrible symptoms. And it was followed again and again by different people in the county. And what really surprised him was the speed that this thing was hitting people. And within a day of them not feeling well, they were down for the count. I mean, they were too weak to get out of bed. It hit them like a truck. And quite a few of them were dying, and he really didn't know what this was. He was quite concerned. He didn't think it was influenza because there was no documented flu in history that would knock people off their feet in a day, and certainly not one that had a death rate like this one had. And what was even more puzzling was, in the doctor's experience, it seemed like the stronger the person was, the more likely they were to come down with this thing with serious symptoms and die. I mean, it literally made no sense. He didn't know what this was, and whatever it was not a reportable disease like typhoid or something like that at the time. So there was really no way of tracking this in the United States, and I don't think anywhere in the world at the time. But a lot of experts do believe it may have started in Kansas because it's the first place, as far as we know, that it was documented in any journal in the world. So I don't know if that's, it's not an absolute guarantee, and we discover new things all the time, but it is, as far as we know, the first documented place anywhere in the world. So what's going on in 1918? Well, World War II is going on. And we got into World War II very late as far as the war goes. And a lot of Haskell County residents were signing up, just like we did here in Sanford and places around Maine and New England. And where they went, if they were in Kansas, was Camp Funston. And that's now, I think it's still running, Fort Riley in Kansas. It was several hundred miles away from Kansas. And this is what it looked like. So it was the 14th cantonment built in the United States. It was absolutely massive. I'm sorry, second one. And had it's about the size of Portland. That's how big this thing was. And they threw this thing together so fast because the country was at a war footing. And, we make things happen here in the United States. And one thing that contributed to this starting here in Kansas was it was an extremely unusually cold winter in Kansas. And if you've been in the military or been in any type of close groups, there are regulations about how many people can be in a building and all kinds of things like that. So the Army pretty much ignored all that stuff because guys were freezing. And you want to go where the warm people with the best stoves are to keep warm. So that probably wasn't a really good idea at the time. And oh, just repeated that slide. So on March 4th, the cook reports ill. Not a big deal. Flu happens every year. Everybody knows it does. But within just a few weeks, because of the close nature, there were over 1,000 men that were admitted into the camp hospital. And there were thousands more that were sick but didn't need to go to the hospital. It was really incredible. So here's a picture of Camp Funston before the illness spread around the camp, the influenza, and this is the same place after. This is a very famous photo. I've seen it in the news quite a few times this week, newspapers. It's in just about every textbook you'll ever see, history textbook, but it's pretty amazing. So I don't think they were planning on having that many sick people at one time. And they had several hundred cases of pneumonia, and much like today, I believe the numbers are about the same for the rate of hospitalization. It's about 20% of guys that were having a bad enough time where they really needed to go to the hospital. And, this isn't good. About 38 of them died. So that's a pretty high percentage of people with pneumonia. And the rest of the people that had it in the camp or were infected and didn't know it yet were dispersed around the country, and they went on ships and went to Europe. So another thing that really impacted the spread of this thing was the war. So Woodrow Wilson is very famous for saying that he wanted to do all he could to keep us out of war. Drove Congress crazy. I mean, they wanted him to get into this thing, and he said that he wanted to be able to look a mother in the eye, a mother who lost her son in the war, and be able to say, I did everything I could to keep us out of war. That was his goal. And when he ran out of options, he took this thing on as a righteous cause like you really can't believe. It was almost to the point where it seemed like he had some type of almost this mental illness, like some manic thing about wanting to win at any cost. And it was a very different place back then, the U.S. in 1918. There was absolutely no room for disloyalty whatsoever. If you weren't on board, you were pretty much considered an enemy at the time. So we had things like the Espionage Act passed. The postmaster would look at your mail. If anything was unpatriotic or critical, it wouldn't go in the mail and you'd get reported. Library of Congress would report people who borrowed books on Germany or imperialism or anything like that. And of course, there was the famous Schenck versus U.S. case, which is known in some circles as the clear and present danger case. That came about because of World War I. And basically, that said that basically anything the government decides to do to quell or to stop might interfere with free speech is okay, as long as that action the country takes is a clear and present danger to the country. So that has since been modified, and it really doesn't pertain to us now, but it was quite a shock back then. And this is very interesting to me. The FBI at the time, they hired or enlisted patriotic Americans, about 200,000 of them, and they were all over the place. They were in every state, every community, and their job was to spy on their neighbors. And if they thought you were doing anything suspicious, you got reported, and they'd come check you out. Another important thing was there was a group, a government organization called the CPI, the Committee on Public Information, and their job was to control the spread of information in the United States, including newspapers. And one thing that group did to control the messaging in the country was they trained 100,000 men nicknamed 4-Minute Men. And what these guys would do is whenever there was a sporting event or a silent film or a theatrical event or anything, these men would go to it. They'd give a 4-minute rousing rah 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 USA speech, and then they'd sit down. And it was, it's kind of a form of indoctrination, getting people on board. Uh, and you really couldn't question these guys. You went along with what they said, and as far as we know, they always got a very rousing response. But they also, the CPI also controlled the newspapers in the United States. And I don't mean typing every single article that came out, but it became very clear to newspaper publishers that there was to be no disloyalty or anything that might make people feel demoralized in the newspapers. So very often the CPI would send out columns to newspapers, and they needed to be run unedited, whether the local editor felt it was appropriate or not. That's the way it was going to be. And very often these columns were completely cherry picked and really weren't an unbiased form at all. But above all, in this time, you had to be 100% Americanism. So no room for question or disloyalty or anything whatsoever. They even banned songs that might hurt morale. If you were a slacker, they would come find you, the locals. And we did find an example of someone from Sanford. I can't remember the guy's name now, but a slacker back then was somebody who would not buy a war bond. And for those of you who may not be familiar with it, the way we financed wars for many, many years was by buying war bonds. The government didn't borrow money. They would simply issue bonds and get people, patriotic people, to buy them. And you're basically lending money to the government to fight the war. So we had a whole bunch of these in World War I. They were really important and very instrumental to financing the war and making it successful. So if you were somebody who could buy a bond and you wouldn't, you were a slacker. And they would find you, and sometimes they'd beat these people up, accuse you of hating America or something. And there was this poor guy from Sanford that got his name put on the front page of the Sanford Tribune for not buying a war bond. And I can't remember if they labeled him as a slacker or not, but goodness, can you imagine that happening to one of us today? Wow. And there was a draft, of course. So every male 18 to 45 had to register. And the Red Cross, we had a chapter right around here. They were almost non-existent before World War I. And they ended up going from about 100 chapters to almost 4,000 by the end of the war. And it gives you an idea of the incredible mobilization power that we had in 1918. And unfortunately, if you look at it in hindsight, the Army, of course, what physicians do they want? Well, they want the best ones. And in 1917, 1918, medicine was really starting to change. It was going from that really unusual restoring balance to the body to getting more into scientific things and testing people and trying to find out exactly what the illness was. So the best physicians that came out of like Johns Hopkins University at the time, they were immediately called up and you didn't see them again. So the physicians that were left were really the old school guys who still did phlebotomy and giving people laxatives and things like that. So, boy, civilian healthcare really took a nosedive. So just a little bit about disease and war. It's a huge killer. And for generations, hundreds of years, this was a shock to me. I always thought, obviously, the biggest killer in a war would be combat, but it wasn't. It's disease. And it typically would spread in the armies from people being very closely confined, sometimes catching things from the enemy, and then it would be spread to the civilian populations. For every Civil War soldier that died, two of them died in combat, two of them died of disease. The Boer War was 10 to 1. And the Spanish American War, 1898, it was 6 to 1. And almost all of those six died of typhoid to every one that died in combat. And there was also, this was an unfortunate thing, there was a huge nursing shortage in World War I because George Creel's CPI machine wouldn't let it be known that there was a nursing shortage, and we needed a whole bunch of nurses because that might hurt morale of the people. So there really wasn't a lot done about that in the newspapers. It was a very unfortunate thing. And this is kind of an interesting thing we also discovered. The biggest ongoing threat to any army at the time was typically venereal disease. I mean, who would have guessed that? So here's the famous Uncle Sam recruiting poster pointing at you, "We want you." And there's another poster that also came out of World War I about being careful with the ladies. So it's hard to believe that they had to have something like that back then. So now let's fast forward now to April 1918, going to France, where most of the battle is, most of the war is being waged. So the British Army, of course, is in France, and all of a sudden, a bunch of battalions are just literally just taken right out. The first British Army, I don't know how many people served in it, but they had tens of thousands fall ill within a week and had to be hospitalized. It was absolutely incredible. And the second British Army, a third of an entire artillery brigade, all became sick within 48 hours. Just incredible. Now in Spain, the same month, Spain's neutral in World War I. They're trying to stay completely out of this. And as a result, they weren't censoring their newspapers like we were in France and Germany and all these other places. So they didn't really care what got put in there. They just published things the way it happened. And King Alphonse the 13th himself became ill with what the Spanish saw was this really terrible illness going around. And the newspapers in the United States and different places said, "Oh, that's interesting. Spain, that has nothing to do with us." So it was very widely reported in newspapers around the world that this very famous king in Spain was sick with this mysterious illness. So, of course, newspapers and people, me included, love to come up with quick, catchy names for things. So what did they call this? Of course, the Spanish flu. Has nothing to do with Spain. It didn't start there. It didn't spread in Europe from there. It's all because this their famous king came down with it, and they weren't censoring the newspapers. He did die of it, by the way. Now in France, the end of April, it reaches Paris, it reaches Italy, and the German commander at the time, Ludendorff, he's getting ready for his last real push. He's organizing this massive attack along the Allied lines that is really Germany's, probably their last hope to win the war. And it was repeatedly postponed. And later on, people asked him, "Why did this thing keep getting postponed?" And he said it was because of the influenza. So we don't know if that's really true. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But it certainly wouldn't be a surprise if it hit the German troops just as hard as it hit the Allied troops. Now in June, so there's a 3-day fever, they're calling it. They really don't know what this thing is. It's spreading around England to different islands. It hits Germany. It hits Bombay. India. We called it Bombay back then. And that's in May, and it came on a troop transport. India was a British colony, very heavily involved in World War One. And at first, there were 7 police officers that became sick, sepoy as they called him. Then the next day, the dock workers started getting sick, and then the port workers started falling sick. It was literally one day after another, and it was knocking people right off their feet. And then it spread all along the rail lines. And just like your arteries and capillaries uh, all come from your heart and they all branch out, that's exactly what the railroads looked like in India. And it spread just like a bloodborne pathogen or something throughout India. Absolutely incredible numbers. It hit China. Now, we don't know if it started there. It seems to be unlikely, but most of them historically do start in China, and it hit them like a tidal wave. And about half the city in what they called Chongqing back then became ill, and France was no different. France was just unbelievably hit, just scores of people. And then something really alarming happened. They were always sick people coming from this, but in this one particular case, there were about 1,000 recruits that became ill, and about almost 50 of them died. Now, what on earth? We knew at the time that flus don't cause a mortality rate of 5%. That's impossible. So they still didn't know what this thing was, and it still wasn't being published in the newspapers. And it spread to the entire surrounding population, and it just wreaked havoc. And what scientists believe obviously happened was that this virus must have mutated into a much deadlier form. And it does happen. The more people that will get this thing, the more mutations there are, and the better chance that it will mutate into something that may not work, but also something that could be super virulent. Now we come to the USA, June 30th. And boy, this took me a long time to find this picture. This ship, the city of Exeter, comes to Philadelphia, and they are in a absolutely horrific state. It came from England, from Europe. Everybody seemed to be fine when they left the port, but when they got to Philadelphia, it was just incredible. The number of sick people, and the U.S. Public Health Service at the time didn't even have a policy about this. So the British, the officers that were still alive on the ship were asking, what do we do to the United States, which they really should do. And we really had no idea. This had never happened before. And the British consul was consulted, sorry for the pun, and they ended up just evacuating the entire wharf. They told everybody to get away from the ship, don't look at it, get out of sight. And they ended up sneaking the sickest crew members to Penn Hospital in Philadelphia. And the rest of them were kept on the ship. And many of them died at the hospital. And all the nursing staff and everyone was said, don't tell anybody about this. Don't tell anybody. If you do, we can arrest you for, being a clear and present danger, all kinds of things like that. And the people on the ship that were quarantined, it worked. And it was only about a week or so that they were quarantined, and everybody either caught it and survived or caught it and died. And it was done. The flu, well, now we know it was the flu. It just burned itself out on the ship. It was done. And boy, I think we all have to look back now and realize how lucky Philadelphia got. They dodged a bullet on that one. And what got in the paper? That's an incredible story. But what got in the paper about it? Nothing. Nothing was printed in the papers. Could hurt morale. It kept spreading. Oh, I just skipped over that slide. So it hit Denmark, Norway, and then Brest has the largest port I think it was the largest port in Europe, certainly in France. And this extremely high mortality rate starts breaking out. And there were troops from Arkansas that were coming there, and almost half the troops that from the United States that were fighting in Europe came through that one port in Brest. And what was really unusual is the people getting sick were getting what's called cyanosis. And again, I'm not a doctor, but in our research, uh, turning cyanotic simply means that your lungs can't transfer enough oxygen. And usually it's because you're fighting a respiratory illness, you have pneumonia, and that all that fluid in your lungs is preventing air from oxygenating your blood. And if it gets bad enough, in a really bad case, you can start actually turning blue. We've probably all seen people with blue fingertips or blue lips or something like that. Imagine your whole body turning blue. That's really just unbelievable. And uh, and I don't want to frighten people. This is not what's happening today. This is 102 years ago. But some doctors and locals were saying, well, what is this? The Black Death coming back? You know, the decimated parts of Europe. And just within a matter of weeks, the entire area is just taking incredible casualties from this illness. It keeps spreading. It reaches Sweden, 1918, and Holland. All right, now we're in New England. So late August 1918, Commonwealth Pier in Boston, 2 sailors are sick, not a big deal. The next day, 8 report sick, again, not a big deal. You know, it is summer, it's a little early for flu season, but who knows what's happening. 58 get ill. Okay, now we've got something's going on they don't really know about. And again, August is kind of an unusual month to have the flu. Now, Camp Devens is very important in Sanford's history because everybody that served in World War I from this area went to Camp Devens in Massachusetts for training. And just like Camp Funston in Kansas, this thing was thrown together so quickly, 10 and a half buildings per day were put up. Just an amazing, I can't even imagine building one of these things in 3 months, never mind that many. And it wasn't as big as Camp Funston, but 15,000 people, that's a big camp. It was, they tried to do the best they could, but they never actually finished the sewage system, and they just dumped everything right in the Nashua River. And like any military unit at the time, they were really worried about measles and pneumonia. Measles is probably the only thing that was more contagious at the time than the regular flu. And September 1st, 4 soldiers come down with pneumonia. 2 days later in Boston, and this is we don't know who this guy is. I've never been able to find his name, but there's a civilian that's admitted to Boston City Hospital, and it's the first civilian we know of that came down with this new strain in the United States. And then, let's see, this is 4 days later now at Camp Devens. Soldier is sick, not a big deal. But this is what was really unusual. He was severely aching. He was delirious. A doctor went over to examine him, try to find out what's going on. And when the doctor touched him, he screamed because it hurt so much. Doctor had no idea what this guy has, but he did fit the bill for having meningitis. So that's temporarily what they diagnosed him with. And then about the same time in the Philadelphia Naval Yard, guess what? A bunch of troops from Boston arrive, and they mix in with people going all over the country. The next day at Camp Devens, a dozen people report ill, not a big deal, 15,000 men there. They don't do any quarantining because there was no connection noted with what happened at the Commonwealth Pier. And then on the 10th, all of a sudden, 1,500 soldiers report ill. Now, remember, this isn't Camp Funston or Europe. This is right here in New England. And Sanford boys soon start becoming ill. And my students found these Sanford boys we know were at Camp Devens on September 10th. May have been some other ones too, but some of you watching might be some relatives on here, possibly. And then the next day, on September 22nd, we lose our first Sanford resident, Linwood Littlefield, who lived on Goodwin Street. And here's a photo from a few years ago. 21 Good, now it's 21 Goodwin Street. He had only been sick for a few days. Very young guy. That's so unusual. 23 years old. And typically at the time in the military, if you got sick, they would somehow get you to a phone and let you call home, tell your parents that you're sick. This guy was knocked off his feet so quick, he didn't even make it to make a phone call. And as a socially interesting thing, he had what pretty much everybody had at the time. There was a funeral held in his home. And a lot of my students kind of freak out when they hear this. They're like, what? That's unbelievable. Well, actually, that's the way it was done for probably a couple thousand years. Where else would you have the funeral? There's no such thing as a funeral parlor. There was one in Sanford at the time, but you probably had to have a lot of money to have that done. Left behind a pretty big family. And then at Camp Devens, things really took a turn for the worse. So 20% of the entire camp was on sick report. That's something horrible going on. And what's even worse is 3/4 of them were so bad off they had to be hospitalized. These are unbelievable numbers, basically unprecedented in modern history. And the next day, the first Sanford serviceman passes away, Tom Carrier, who lived on Brook Street. That's what his house looked. Might have new siding now. Brook Street is right near Lafayette School. And for those people who might be watching, might think, oh my goodness, I live there or I grew up there. Well, remember, this is 102 years ago. So anything that happened back then has no connection with what's going on right now. So nobody's in any danger now from what happened back then, and don't worry about that. And then right after that, hundreds of cases of pneumonia, and Camp Devens puts out an alert. They only have 25 doctors. They can't handle what's happening now with these thousands of men that need help. So they put out a telegraph, and they're asking any doctor in New England to please report to Camp Devens. And boy, did they. I mean, they brought in about 225 doctors, and they were all putting in 16-hour days. And not a big surprise to anybody, they didn't have N95 masks back then. And we didn't have the knowledge we have now. And the nurses and doctors started becoming sick, and they started dying also. And I remember, this is 1918. This is not 2020. And the hospital that they had designed pretty well to hold 1,200 men had 6,000 in it, just completely overrun. And the real problem there is with the nurses and doctors getting sick and the huge number of people that were sick at the same time, care basically was non-existent there. It was as bad as you can imagine at Camp Devens. I'm not going to go into much detail because I don't want people to get too freaked out here, but it was bad. And every physician that we've been able to find documents from, including one from Sanford that went, one young guy, they all said it was the most intense pneumonia they had ever seen. They didn't know what it was, but they had never seen pneumonia like this. And finally, September 27th, remember when this thing started? It's back in January, February, and it mutated sometime over the summer. Nobody in Sanford knew about this in the Sanford Tribune till September 27th. So just amazing. And when local people start passing away, you can't hide that anymore. So they had to put this in the newspaper. And Linwood Littlefield got in there. I put F because I think he was in Framingham, if I remember right. Tom Carrier from Brook Street passed away. He was at Devon's. William LeBreau. Now look at these ages. Isn't that unusual? Tom Bennett lived on 35 State Street. If you guys are going up 202 toward Lebanon, Sleeper's Market is on the right. State Street is right there. The very next building right on the corner, that's Thomas Bennett's house. And then what we did was we ended up looking at cemetery records in all of the big three cemeteries for people who died or were buried there starting at this time that the newspaper may have missed. And we found one buried at Oakdale who was never mentioned in the newspaper, Hannah Hobson. And we don't have no idea if she had influenza or not, but it was unusual for somebody her age to get sick like that. And then October 4th, boy, did this thing hit Sanford. There were so many people sick that obviously we had some epidemic on our hands. And the superintendent of schools ended up closing schools in Sanford as, precautionary measure. And they called it the Spanish influenza. It must have come to Sanford. So that's October 4th. It was just a few days later that they ended up doing that. And in that newspaper, we had some more guys pass away. We had Albert Gay, Winfield Wilson. Again, look at the ages. These aren't people in their 70s, 80s, 90s. These are really, young, healthy people. And here's another one from a local paper that died, Leocadie Perot. I'm sorry, she was not in the paper. And we don't know if she had influenza or not. It's quite possible due to her age. And boy, is this is a bit of a coincidence. So we've probably seen in the news how a lot of people in the Bath shipyards, I know the union members don't want to be there right now because they're worried about the pandemic spreading in there. Well, the same thing happened. We were still at war at this time, and 1,400 men at the Bath shipyard ended up coming down with influenza, and just as many at Portsmouth, or what we called in Maine, Kittery. And there were so few nurses available because most of them were in Europe. They just weren't getting the attention they needed. So the Sanford Red Cross and the Sanford Public Safety Committee put out a request for nurses all over the state. And 60 nurses responded, and the most nurses that came from any place was Sanford. We had 12 nurses. So kudos to us. We had a nursing school on the campus of what was Goodall Hospital, so that probably had a lot to do with the 12 nurses. And there's a few more articles in here. The health officer was basically telling everybody to close, schools, theaters, churches, clubs, telling everybody to close till at least October 13th. And some people thought that he had overstepped his boundary, that he couldn't do that. And then there's a few things in here of some people complaining in the Sanford Tribune for various reasons. And then the Sanford Tribune also very helpfully published something from the Sanford Board of Health about what to do about the Spanish influenza. They said, don't jump to conclusions if you have a cough or a sneeze, and it's some good advice for today. And does this sound familiar? Wash your hands often. And they said gargle with salt water and a few other things they have in here. Avoid going to church, schools, theaters, especially if you or anybody of your family has symptoms of the grip. And the grip is an old nickname for pneumonia. And you may remember that from Guys and Dolls musical. Can't remember the song it comes from, but avoid crowds. Now, here's another interesting little tidbit. Years ago, when I was a little kid, my dad told me we were driving down Main Street, And somehow the topic of spitting came out. My dad said, "You know, it's illegal to spit on the sidewalk in Sanford." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Yeah." And he said it was think it was a $3 fine, he told me. And I'm thinking, how can that be illegal? And now we know why. Because communities all across the country started passing ordinances and rules about spitting on the sidewalk or any public place because they believed it would spread the influenza. And another little funny tidbit, they're telling everybody here to sneeze into your handkerchief or another cloth and then, boil or burn it. And I always remark to my students, geez, why don't they tell people to use a tissue? Wouldn't that be more sanitary? And usually somebody realizes, oh, tissue hadn't been invented yet. So both my grandfathers and many people, if you're old enough, you probably remember them carrying around a handkerchief in their pocket. So now the only semblance of that we see is people who have a little pocket square that's supposed to be an old handkerchief. And the next Sanford Tribune was published twice a week back then. It was getting worse here locally. And now, for the first time, we have locals passing away from influenza. So we had Albert Anktel on River Street, Dennis Augustinos on Clark Street. That's now would be right just about smack in the middle of the Midtown Mall. So that whole area was razed. Doesn't belong there anymore. And then William Couturier from Brook Street, Angelina LaValle, I believe she was pregnant, on Dale Street, and that is off Emory. It's on the right when you cross Pioneer Avenue. School Street, Albert Taylor. Look at these ages. It's just amazing. And Xavier Goodney. Now remember that name, Xavier Goodney, lived on Perkins Court. Perkins Court is when you're going up High Street past Paris Pizza, headed out of town, you go up toward North Ave. Perkins Court's on the right, about halfway up the hill. So we're going to get back to him later. And then I found 7 more people that passed away, similar ages, that never got in the Sanford Tribune. I don't know why. I don't know why they wouldn't have been in there. And this is how we got a lot of our information. So in the next Sanford Tribune, 8 more people passed away, which is a really unusual number in just a matter of days. And again, I found 6 more going through cemetery records that weren't, for whatever reason, weren't put in the newspaper. So one of the big draws to the Sanford Tribune was the, quote, local news. And if you went to visit anybody, or you broke your leg, or you ended up in the hospital, or your parents were having a 50th anniversary, it got in the newspaper. So, these federal guidelines about privacy? No way. If it was newsworthy, it got in the paper. And we kind of nicknamed this a gossip column now. But if you go through this thing, it is unbelievable the number of people that were down with pneumonia or the grip or the influenza, just name after name after name. And I've got a spreadsheet of them somewhere. This was the worst case. We don't know for sure if this was due to influenza, but you probably recognize this place. It's on Emory Street, right behind Domino's Pizza, a few houses down, 15 Emory. And this apartment on the left, see that door on the left? That's the left side of that building. That was the residence of the Letourneaus. And they had 3 young kids pass away. I tend to think it was influenza, even though it rarely took little kids like this. But we're pretty sure the parents had it because they were so ill themselves that they couldn't even make it to their kids' funerals. So very, very unusual in Sanford. That was the worst case anywhere here in the then town. And of course, you're always going to have some people trying to take advantage of this. So our FDA right now is cracking down on people that are making these wild claims that can't be supported. So if you think you've got influenza, guard yourself with Johnson's anodyne liniment, the enemy to germs. So they might get arrested now if they tried to do that today. And then on October 25th, we had 6 more people reported passed away. 4, again, were unreported that I found in various cemeteries around here. And then the order to close theaters, churches, schools, lodges, and pool rooms was revoked. So that lasted about 3 weeks. We had 3 weeks of no school. And as far as I know, I don't think there was any distance learning. There, some people may have gotten some packets maybe the teachers put together, but I'm not sure how they would have done it other than if they assigned reading and let the kids take books home. It's possible. Couldn't find any records of that. And I won't go too much into this, but there are today a few people in the news, a few religious leaders that are refusing to not have church services. And we actually had one here in Sanford at the Reverend of Notre Dame Church in Springvale. The Board of Health ordered him to close, and he refused to, and they actually arrested him, Reverend Cassavant. So he ended up going to the York County Jail, which was on 202 at the time. It's that old brick building just after the courthouse. Still has some bars on it. And 2 church members went and bailed him out. And the Springvale Advocate was also a newspaper, and they also published that the public gathering ban was going to be lifted that night at 6 p.m. Then November 1st, the wave was pretty much over at this time in Sanford, and there were 10 more deaths reported in that newspaper edition, and I only found 1 in a cemetery that hadn't been put in the paper. And just like that, I just snapped my fingers, the deaths stopped. It just ended. Let me just go back here a second. It ended, I'll forget it. It ended just as fast as it started. It swept into Sanford very suddenly, and just about 3 weeks later, it was gone. Maybe 4 weeks total. And these symptoms just hit people and knocked them off their feet within a day. Just incredible. So a couple notable events. This is one that it's the first time I've really heard this ever being mentioned, and it's coming up quite frequently now, is the Great Philadelphia Liberty Loan Parade. So every big community in the country, they want to do their part. We're in World War I. Actually, it's called the Great War back then, because we didn't know there was going to be a World War II yet. And we've got to raise money for the troops and to build submarines and get food and do everything we can. So everybody's behind this. We're selling bonds, having parades, trying to boost morale to get people to buy bonds. Philadelphia is scheduled to have a huge Liberty Loan Parade. We're talking probably 200,000 people at this parade. And the 2 local public health officers are seeing what's coming, and they're thinking, we don't know what this thing is. We just know it's incredibly contagious and very deadly. So they went to go find the mayor, and according to what we discovered, they couldn't find the mayor because he was embroiled in some type of scandal and was literally hiding in his closet. Nobody could find this guy. So they went to the organizer of the parade and said, you have to cancel this parade. And the organizers said, are you kidding? We can't cancel this thing. Can you imagine what it would do to morale? People love these parades, and we've got to raise so many millions of dollars. So the leader refused to stop the parade, and the parade went on as planned. And within 10 days, hundreds of thousands of people in Philadelphia were sick, almost all at the same time. It was absolutely incredible when you read stories about what happened, what was going on in Philadelphia. And it was so horrendous, they just didn't know how to deal with all these people passing away. And the worst week was October 16th, that's about when it was peaking over here, actually, in Sanford. So they lost 4,500, almost 4,600 people in 1 week. And you just can't even imagine the scope of what was happening there. And much of that is due to the fact that these happened so quickly, it spread so quickly to so many people that it absolutely overwhelmed the hospitals. Hospitals just couldn't, you can't deal with that many sick people at one time. And I guess the only bright thing about having something hit so rapidly across such a wide population is that it stops very quickly because there's no one left for it to infect. So it came and went in Philadelphia quite quickly, but the devastation that it wreaked was famous. I mean, we're still talking about it 102 years later. So a couple other interesting events that happened. The USS Leviathan was a troop carrier coming from England, and it had the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, oh, I've got his name on there, Franklin Roosevelt on it. And they decided to be really smart. So they divided this thing into 4 compartments to make sure that if this sneaky influenza broke out on the ship, no more than 1/4 of the ship would get sick. And it didn't work. So they were all sick within a very short period of time, virtually the entire ship. And I'm not going to go into details because it's kind of like a Stephen King novel. But what they didn't realize was that everybody was eating at the same mess hall. So even though only 1 compartment, 1/4 of the ship was allowed out at a time, they all ate in the same place. And this thing is so easy to contract that it spread to the whole ship. And it arrived, I think it came to New York. And Woodrow Wilson was told about it. And March, who was the head of the sort of like the public health for the United States, they didn't do anything about it. They didn't even want to talk about it. And one of the most sick people on the ship was Franklin Roosevelt, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he probably would have died if it weren't for the amount of money that his family had. And they brought him to his mother's compound, her apartment in New York City, and it took him months to recover. He had a very serious pneumonia and almost passed away. And then Camp Grant, there was a train that left there with 3,000 healthy men, and before the train got to its destination, 2,000 of them had to be hospitalized. And they were told they could not get off the train. Nobody could get on or off the train until they got to the end of their journey. So, for a little bit of humor now, even though it may be too late for that, these are things that were tried. Oh, my dog wants to go out. Andrew? She's staring at me with her guilty eyes. These are things we know that don't work. Hydrogen peroxide. If you inject yourself with it, it won't kill the flu. Mustard plaster. Makes you sweat like crazy, won't stop the flu. Drinking very small amounts of mercuric chloride doesn't work. Rubbing creosote on your lymph nodes doesn't work. And arsenic, now this one did work. It did kill the flu. Unfortunately, it also killed the patients. But, hey, Hugs, hold on. Hey, Andrew? My dog wants to go out really bad now. But we're almost done. And this is my favorite one. Hanging camphor balls and garlic around your neck. So this didn't work, but nobody who did this was ever attacked by a vampire. So there was a bright side to it. And what lessons did we learn from the Spanish flu, or should we have learned? And I didn't write this this year. This was written in 2004. So, number one, most important thing, no public gatherings. If there is some epidemic going on, if you really want to stop it, that's one of the things you have to do is just do not let people gather in public. And to the extent it's possible, if somebody gets sick or they're showing symptoms, you have to quarantine them as soon as possible and be really strict. Don't let people visit them. Don't let them go out, to run errands or anything like that. And the communities that did the best were the most organized ones. It really came down to organization, because something on this scale we learned in 1918, the US government cannot help. There just aren't enough of anything. There aren't enough troops, there aren't enough National Guard people, there's just not enough money. So, and again, this is kind of funny, this is written 16 years ago. The way I presented this is, if this ever happens again, we really need to be organized. And we also learned, 1918, if you hide information from people, people feel like they're not in control, and rumors start spreading. And very often the rumors are worse than the facts. So it's very clear, what we learned in 1918, that information, it really inspires people, and it gives people a sense of control. Even if it's bad news, people feel like they're more in control if they know what's going on. And for the next pandemic, hey, Andrew, can you let Hugs out? For the next pandemic, we need respirators. And this sounds a little strange now, but this was written 16 years ago. So in a normal flu season, just about every respirator in the country is being used. And I don't know what the number is right now, but back when we did this 16 years ago, there were about 105,000 respirators in the United States, and they're all being used. So if there is a pandemic coming, we need more than that. We've got to have more respirators, because that's what keeps people alive when their pneumonia gets bad enough. So if you hear anybody saying we couldn't possibly have foreseen this, nobody has ever seen anything like this before, that is not true at all. Maybe they haven't seen it, but we've been through something very similar to this on this scale since in 1918. And another problem we had, vaccines really started coming out as a result of this Spanish influenza. And we can't just have one place making vaccines or two places. We have to have them in a bunch of places in case an illness spreads somewhere and it shuts that production down. And I just read today that the biggest medical glove maker in the world, a significant amount of their workforce is down because they have come down with the coronavirus. So we don't have a big diversity in glove making. So it's kind of the same thing that happened here in 1918. And this will be interesting to see how this plays out. If another pandemic came along, and remember, this is written in 2004, the next one that comes along, if it's anything like this one, it's going to hit anywhere from 44 to more than 110 million Americans. And it may be many of them getting sick at the same time, quite possibly. Could happen. And where do they come from? People say, why do they come from China? Well, it's because of birds. Remember, influenza comes from birds typically. So look at these numbers from 68, how many pigs and poultry they go through. Pigs can also carry influenza, by the way. And 2006, this was the last time I updated the numbers. They were going through 500 million pigs and 13 billion different types of birds in China, and that was 14 years ago. And that may seem like a crazy number, but we probably go through something similar if you adjust for population. The difference is we don't, handle them ourselves. And if you look in hindsight here at the numbers, the total deaths in 1918 weren't really far off here in town. So I can't remember the exact number. It's really hard to tell because we don't really know who for sure locally had the flu, but you can base it on the age. So we probably lost about 50 people in Sanford, which is quite a few in a matter of about 3 weeks. And the people that were most affected by this thing, and again, this has nothing to do with today, we're talking 1918. It was young, healthy people. The healthier you were, the more likely you were to have serious complications or die from it. And women who were pregnant for some reason, don't know why. So, sometime in the early 2000s, when we found out this new, what they call the bird flu, was coming from Europe, it was probably going to start spreading around the world. Scientists started saying, well, let's find out what happened in 1918 with the Spanish flu and why so many young people were dying. So they actually went to Alaska, I believe it was Alaska. They found people who were victims of the flu that passed away and were buried in permafrost, permanently frozen ground. And they actually extricated the Spanish flu from one of these people. They studied it at the CDC and found out that this strain of influenza was completely unique in that the healthier you were, the more likely you were to die. And the reason was because healthiest people have the most robust defense mechanism, the most robust way to fight off an illness. And this thing just put your body's defense mechanism just the pedal to the metal. It just completely went, it activated almost immediately. So if you're really young and healthy, your lungs just filled right up with all these enzymes and proteins that were produced, and very often you ended up dying. Very few older people passed away, and it's got to be because they had been exposed to some similar strain to this when they were younger. Again, their body recognized it and knocked it out immediately. So the vast majority of people that died from this were probably 20 to 40, 20 to 35. It was really incredible. And a few final thoughts. There's a bunch of amazing stories. If you want to hang on at the end of this thing, I can tell you a few more things that happened. But there is a silver lining to this. So this is Perkins Court, and you remember Xavier Goodney? If you're still watching, I mentioned you might want to remember this because it's going to come back. So he was a immigrant from Quebec, Canada, that came to work in the Sanford Mills, and he was married, had a young child, and unfortunately, he ended up contracting influenza, and not only did he die, but their young child died also. That's where he lived, on Perkins Court. And they had a funeral at St. Ignatius Church, and then he was buried at St. Ignatius Cemetery, and that's where he is today. His name, you might have a hard time finding it because I found it spelled 4 different ways. So I mention him because you can imagine the despair that his wife must have been in from losing a husband and a child. But she persevered. She kept going on, and she actually got remarried. So we'll say that pink dot is Mrs. Goodney. She got remarried and had 4 daughters. 4 wonderful daughters. One of them got married and had 5 kids. And one of those five kids got married and had four kids, and I married one of those kids, and we had two kids. So that's my son Andrew and my daughter Alyssa. So in the darkest times when you think there can't be any hope and things can't get any worse, there is always a silver lining. You may not see it, but it's down the road somewhere. And I don't think any of us are glad that any of this stuff happened, but the way things work, you never know down the road. And I know I'm very grateful for having my two kids, and very happy that their great grandmother decided to persevere. And that's it for the main part here. And I'm happy to take any questions if anybody's watching. If anybody has anything, I'll watch for comments. I think I can still get comments here. And if you've fallen asleep, I don't blame you at all. But if you're thinking of asking a question, there's a couple things I'll mention, a couple kind of interesting stories. We were kind of lucky, even though it doesn't seem like it, in the United States, because we did have a good percentage of the public that was really immune to this thing, particularly older people. And a lot of places around the world weren't so lucky. In the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, these Inuit villages, they had no immunity whatsoever. They had never been exposed to any of these influenzas. And when it reached many of these villages in the Aleutians, it completely wiped them out. There's nothing left. And some scholars and researchers and uh, people who were studying this stuff, they went to go check on the villages, and some of them were completely empty. Everybody passed away. Just unbelievable that something like that, could wreak havoc. And we really don't know what the final numbers were. It's somewhere between probably 50 and 100 million people that passed away. And I don't mean to say that casually, but there's a lot to learn from our response to this. And there are so many similarities in what we're doing and what we did not do compared to 1918 that I hope people who are watching this will make sure when this current one's over, we don't make the same mistakes again that we made in 1918 and apparently have probably repeated again, especially as far as being ready with respirators and emergency gear and things like that. So that was a really unfortunate thing in 1918, and it looks like the respirator thing's happening again. So thank you for anybody who's still watching. I think this will get archived so you can watch it later on. And if you have any questions, feel free to, you can contact the museum or you can email them to me, questions. My school email is pauger@sanford.org. And I may not know the answer, but I might. And we always learn stuff from these things. So I hope everyone stays well. And remember, what happened here, this is 102 years ago. So anything that happened here in Sanford has no direct connection with what's going on today with this current pandemic. So don't worry about that. And I hope everyone remains well. So thank you very much.